Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, still wrapped in a pandemic. I'm sad to report, not that you don't know that. Although in the United States these days, it's feeling like things are over. It sure isn't. There are 6 billion people on planet Earth who still have not had one shot, let alone two. And the sessions I do on that have been, I've probably done 30 different sessions on aspects of that, the pandemic, and then many more on the infodemic, which is wrapped around the pandemic. And that's getting closer to what we're going to talk about today. I'm Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute, now the Climate School at Columbia University. This is Sustain What? Our frequent interrogation of the big questions around us in search of progress, again, on a complex planet where no single episode of the show, no single fix is going to take us where we want to go. I've got a great discussion lined up today with Julia Angwin, someone I was a colleague with at ProPublica a number of years ago. Julia has gone off on her own to use remarkable skill sets that she has in both journalistic and data analytic. And she has created the Markup, which is a fantastic new newsroom that is essentially using big text tools to get behind the machine, to get to reveal both how it works, how it is making society more complicated, how it exploits data sometimes, and what we can do about that. A big focus of me on these shows is where we go from here. Julia, it's great to have you here. I'm just going to unmute you. How are you doing, first of all, amid all?
Great. Thank you for having me on. It's so fun. Yeah, I'm feeling really good now that today's my 2-week anniversary of the second shot. So I feel like I'm actually a free human. I could leave my bedroom, but I'm still here weirdly in my bedroom.
I know. What's it like to run a newsroom, in this environment? Obviously I'm in a newsroom-ish situation at Columbia, but it's not really building a new thing in a dispersed way. It must be really bizarre.
Yeah, it was a little crazy. We just signed a 5-year lease at our Union Square offices, and we were super excited about, our space and hanging out together. And we basically started publishing February 25th, and we left the office, I think, March 13th, and never went back. Amazing. And we just got out of the lease. So now we are fully remote. Wow. Not sure yet if we're going to have an office or what we're going to do. But I have to say, it's been really a pleasure. I didn't know if anyone could withstand this kind of remote operation, and certainly a brand new newsroom that I really hadn't coalesced, but we have managed to pull it off. And it's really heartening to know that you can still have really meaningful interactions remotely and build trust with people. And so it's been a pleasure. And we have done the type of journalism I hoped to do, ambitious, data-driven investigations, and done it all remotely.
Yeah, and of course, much of what you examine is the digital world that we have built around us, and that big companies have built around us, essentially, that we love. We love it so much that even though, as you're interrogating how Facebook works, you're on Facebook. Right here is your Facebook page. And, I'm on Facebook too, and it's one of my main portals to people. So what's it like? Well, maybe let's just back up slightly. I want to walk people a little bit through your own timeline. You were at the Wall Street Journal, I think, early on. You've written a couple of very influential books, Dragnet Nation on privacy, security, and freedom in a world of surveillance and big data. You were at ProPublica, as I said earlier, where you really kind of cut your chops in this mix of data and accountability. This project, the Machine Bias Project, was just incredible. Just, the way you explored how these tools, like finding insurance, this one on insurance rates, somewhere in here, basically saying that if you're in a black neighborhood, you're paying more for car insurance. That sounds kind of, not so consequential, but the issues are very consequential. How did you get into that form of journalism as opposed to the pad and pen and typing?
Yeah, it's a funny story because I grew up in Silicon Valley. I grew up in Palo Alto. My parents had moved there in the 70s to be part of the personal computer revolution. And it was, so I kind of grew up. I had my first computer was like the Apple II, the first one. Mm-hmm. And I didn't ever use a typewriter. I was really unique among my friends in that way. I learned to program in 5th grade. I really kind of that was my world, Silicon Valley. I worked in my summers at Hewlett Packard, and I studied math at University of Chicago because you couldn't study computer science. So I just took computer science on the side. And honestly, journalism was my rebellion, right? So in college, I was like, ooh, what can I do that's so different? And so I started working on the college paper, and I fell in love with it. And so I thought, when I graduated, I did have jobs available to go back in technology. And I thought, I'm just going to have fun for a little while, and then I'll go back to real life. And I started working in journalism. And over time, I realized it took a while. I think I started in DC at a little wire service. Then I went to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1996. And they hired me mostly because they were like, oh my gosh, you know about computers and the internet. And that was when I realized that my background was an advantage. Until then, it was just something I was rebelling against.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And then I realized, oh, actually, I have something that other journalists don't have, which is honestly not that much skill. Like, I can't program anymore. I haven't programmed since college. But what I have is an understanding, honestly, of the capabilities of technology and how to talk to programmers about, if I want to do X, could we do it this way? Could we do it that way? Because a lot of people who don't understand technology think it's magic. And so when they talk to the programmers, they're like, hey, just gin me up some magic data, and it just doesn't work like that. So the skill I've always had is being able to talk to programmers and bring them into the investigative reporting process and help use their skills in service of journalism.
And that was through what years roughly that transition for you fully into sort of?
Well, it was a long transition. So, I mean, when I was at the San Francisco Chronicle in 1996, understanding technology just meant that I was asked slightly smarter questions I wasn't doing any data analysis or anything. It wasn't until I got to the Wall Street Journal in 2000. They hired me to cover the internet right during the boom time, the .com boom, if anyone remembers that. And it was about 2009 that I was covering MySpace, and I went off and wrote a book about MySpace. And I said to my editors, I was like, they have this weird business model that I hadn't seen before, which is basically the product is free, but they monetize this personal data about you. Isn't that creepy? Can I start a series about this? And then they were like, yeah, that sounds creepy. And I hired a programmer. I said, I want you to scrape the web and show me all the cookies and stuff on the top websites, which was actually, in today's terms, not a particularly sophisticated project, but it was really innovative at that time. And then I realized that I could really elevate my reporting by hiring a programmer. So I kept doing it, and then started building that into my practice. And so it was really started in 2009 with that series we did called What They Know.
Amazing. I'm getting a little feedback that I didn't hear before. It's funny, it wasn't there before. Anyway, I just muted you for a second just to work out the feedback question. And I'm going to show, here's one of the pieces from that series, The Web's New Gold Mine, Your Secrets, essentially turning, this is that critical moment. And so now the word algorithm, the word feed always comes up, what's special about, maybe let's just say Facebook and Google, what do we not know about that process that then you've flipped? You're using the same methods now to sort of dig in on telling the story of how that all affects our lives going forward.
Well, I think when I started this project in 2010, right, the issue at that time was the issue known that we call privacy, which was essentially they're collecting all this data about you. And it wasn't until maybe a couple years into doing that reporting that I realized that the real harm was, well, what do they do with that data? That's what the algorithms come in, and that's where they put you into little boxes and decide what you should see on your newsfeed, or what ads you should see, or what credit card you should be offered, etc. And so as I started honing in on the personal data exploitation business, algorithms were really the engine that powers that business. And so I started realizing I needed to analyze algorithms as And that was a challenge, right? Because looking at, who's surveilling you is, I wouldn't say easy, but it's easier than trying to reverse engineer an algorithm. And I would say like one of the first ones that I really spent a lot of time reverse engineering was the one you mentioned in the beginning, machine bias. This was an algorithm for criminal risk assessment. So basically, if you're arrested, you would fill out a little quiz about yourself. You wouldn't fill it out. They ask you questions when they're booking you. And then they assign a score, 1 through 10, whether you're likely to commit another crime in the next 2 years. You don't know anything about this score. And then the judge, when deciding whether to release you on bail, looks at that score and takes that into account when making that decision, because it's like basically a safety risk assessment. And this,
pre-crime, when I learned, but with lots of problems in doing the pre-crime analysis.
Yeah, I mean, when I learned that what Minority Report was real and was actually being used across the country in U.S. courtrooms, I was blown away. I'm a tech reporter, right? I didn't know. I was like, what? That's crazy. So then I was like, well, I want to figure out if this thing is real. So what we did was we FOIA'd, we did public records requests to get the scores that were assigned to 18,000 people in Broward County. These are 2 of them here. And then we spent 6 months looking up whether they went on to commit a crime or not in the next 2 years. Essentially, whether this algorithm true, right? Was it predicting correctly? And what we found was not so much, right? Like, so it was only 60% accurate, which I have to say, like, personally, if I was 60% accurate in my job, I'd be fired in a hot second. But it was also biased. Black defendants were much more likely they were twice as likely as white defendants to be incorrectly labeled as future risks when they weren't. And white defendants were twice as likely to be misclassified as low risk when they were actually high risk. And so it was a really biased score racially, which of course is not that surprising because our whole criminal justice system is racially biased. But it was shocking to see it encoded in an algorithm, because how would you ever argue against that bias? Like, you would have to go into this courtroom and say, I'm not a 7 risk, I'm a 2. Who has the ability to make that kind of argument, right? And so that was, I think, when I realized that the power of trying to hold these algorithms to account by actually just doing the hard work of figuring out, do they work and who do they affect?
So take us now to your current operation. What led you to go out on your own and launch a project like this? And just tell us, I've explained at the beginning the basic idea. Big tech is watching you, we're watching big tech, and you're using AI and big data collection to do that.
Yeah.
Those surveys and stuff. So how did this come about?
So, I mean, as you know, you and I were both at ProPublica, which is, honestly, it's one of the greatest jobs in journalism. And I was getting to do cool stories like machine bias. And the thing is, I just felt that there was so many algorithms and so much that needed to be done like that. And I wanted a newsroom that was set up to do that, right? What I was doing was sort of borrowing one of the programmers from the news apps team and then hiring an outside programmer and cobbling together like a little bit of a data investigation shop within ProPublica. And that wasn't what that newsroom was set up to do. And so I realized that to do this kind of work where the engineering is part of the investigation and it's not just something separate, I wanted to set up a newsroom where engineers were integrated into the investigations. So I left, which honestly was scary. I left the greatest job in journalism, and then I basically was like, okay, I'm going to go try to raise money. I didn't have any money, right? So it could have just not happened. But I did it. I luckily got some great commitments of funding and was able to put together this newsroom that is basically half programmers and half sort of more traditional journalists who work together to do really ambitious projects. Like the one you're showing right now is Citizen Browser, which I think is our most ambitious project, where we decided we wanted to see what is Facebook deciding to show to people. Like, what is it? All you see when you go on Facebook is your own feed. But actually, as we all know, everybody has their own filter bubble and they're all seeing different things. And so the only way to get a sense of really what's happening globally on Facebook was to build a national panel of users who shared data with us. So we built a tool called Citizen Browser. It's basically a little web browser. They log into Facebook through it on their computer. And then it allows us to basically take little snapshots of their feed at least once a day, sometimes couple times a day, and we analyze that data. We take all the personally identifiable information out, but we keep the stuff that, like, the ads they're shown, the news they're shown, and we can, right. And that way we can hold Facebook accountable for those decisions it's making about what to amplify and what to show to its users. That wouldn't be known if we hadn't built this sort of ambitious panel of users.
Is it now? How do you shape a panel? It reminds me of what Frank Luntz does with tracking
how we
public feels and does things.
We kind of borrow from pollsters, right? Like, so essentially we're working with a firm that does public survey research, and they pay users to install this tool for us. And so they have people who agree to participate in all types of surveys. Most of them are not technical. They're usually questions, right? Because polling is still, mostly asking and answering questions. This is a different type of thing, right? Because we don't ask them anything except to identify their age and gender and geography.
Maybe is it more like Nielsen? Is it like Nielsen?
It's more like Nielsen. It's actually more like putting a black box on your TV and seeing and being part of a panel that sort of says which shows are popular. I modeled it mentally on Nielsen, right? The fact that there is no Nielsen, by the way, for the biggest advertising industry, right? I mean, between Facebook and Google, these are, a huge $50-100 billion industry, and there's no oversight. It is kind of amazing that there's not a Nielsen already, but it's actually because they don't let you do what what we're doing is something that I think Facebook has argued in the past, that users are not allowed to contribute their data to research projects. So they, filed a cease and desist against a project at NYU where users were contributing their political ads. And so they don't make it easy to have oversight of their platform.
So how are you able to pursue this? They're not blocking it, or?
They're not blocking it. We've done, we're really careful. Right? We redact all this personal information. We only take the very bare minimum of what we need. We actually can't access the user's information. We've technically blocked ourselves from being able to access any personally identifiable information. So what we have from these people who participate is the things they've identified themselves to us as, I'm this age, I'm this gender, I'm this race, I have this political leaning, and this geography. And those are the 5 characteristics we have. And then we have sort of information that Facebook chose to show to them, and not their friends' comments or chats or any of that. All of that's redacted. And we feel like, because we're doing it so carefully, and we're also very transparent about our methods, we publish these big methodologies and we publish our data sets. So I don't know, but so far we haven't faced anything from Facebook, except, they sometimes say to us when we call them for comment, they say, oh, your sample size is too small, you can't really draw conclusions, which is fair. They're a 2.7 billion platform. Our sample is, about 1,000 people. But it is what it is. It's better than anyone else's insight,
Is that what you're saying? And I'm seeing now, obviously, you've had some results in the sense that here, there's a Facebook saw something and responded.
Recently, we found, looking at the ads on their platform, that Facebook had allowed some ads to go through for credit and loan opportunities that were targeted by age. Under the civil rights laws, you can't offer credit opportunities to only specific groups of people under certain protected characteristics. And Facebook's own policy says you can't use those types of targeting criteria for credit, housing, and employment. And yet we found some that had slipped through. And so we wrote about it, and they then pledged to remove them. And this is a very common pattern. I mean, anyone who's watched Facebook at all has seen something like this happen, where they make a mistake, they say sorry, they say they'll fix it, then somebody finds it didn't fix it. It's unfortunately the problem with self-regulation, right, is that they're the only ones really in charge of their own compliance.
But that brings to mind something else that years ago, gosh, it was like, I don't know how old this book is now. 2011, God, 10 years ago. I'm a big fan of David Weinberger. He wrote this book, Too Big to Know. The subtitle is Rethinking Knowledge Now that the facts aren't the facts, experts are everywhere, and the smartest person in the room is the room. But it's a really cool book about where we're at. He has a new one out on chaos, but online. But the interesting thing here was, and I keep thinking about this sometimes as we move. We're going to talk about the split screen thing in a minute, but where do we go from here is the big question. Sometimes I look at Facebook and I look at these tools, and I can't kind of get the sense they're way bigger than anyone, even the people who designed them, ever made. They're way bigger than the tools we have, as you say. They have internal analytics that can tell some things, but like the way pandemic moved around, the idea that we can get ahead of that, the that misinformation.
Well, that's their line.
So is it too big to know?
They argue that. That's their argument, right? They argue that it's a giant system. I mean, Alex Stamos, who used to work there and now runs the Stanford Cyber Initiative, I think, he's always sort of said, these systems are just so gigantic, they can't be policed. And okay, maybe. But what is really interesting is that when companies have liability for their actions, they find ways to mitigate risk. And currently, Facebook doesn't have any liability, right? Boeing has liability. You know what? Planes are pretty complicated too. And they have liability, so they actually work on it. Now, the 737 MAX was obviously a disaster, but overall, air safety has massively improved and is incredible. And so I'm not sure that particularly the American spirit, we can go to the moon, we can do anything. I don't know. I think we could probably make Facebook a little better.
Well, I think in a way, the feedback mechanism you built is, I guarantee you, it's nudging Facebook in the right direction. Now,
I hope
is there a big way to do that? Does regulation play a role? That liability question is so interesting. Law. I guess Europe is more on that game than
they're moving there, right? Slowly, but the problem is it's hard because of jurisdiction issues. These are companies that are really based here, so for true kind of penalties and fines, it has to probably come primarily from the U.S. And we're seeing some movement, but it's just, I think nobody knows exactly what the right answer is, and I'm not saying I do either. I'm not a policy expert, but I do think that when you think about how we have made things safe in the past, right? Cars used to blow up.
Right.
Liability really helped, right. So it is a very, very good tool for mitigating risk.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a good metaphor. Both of the ones you just mentioned, aviation. I wrote about Flight 800, the crash of that 747, and actually the 1996 for the Times, and living that story for weeks. And the moral of that story was actually the failure mode there will never actually be fully known. There were all these actually conspiracy theories running around it, like it's so common around big issues now. And yet it was that we've gotten to the point with air traffic where almost every crash is either immediately evident as a human failure or something, or it's too big to understand. That it'll be new failures because of these 3 or 4 different things have to fail at the same time to get to the level of that plane blowing up. This is very different because it's not a micro consequence. You have this global system that's on an hourly basis able to inflame or not inflame and do all kinds of things.
It regulates all political discourse, right? It's kind of insane that this one company can decide anything. They can decide that you just can't say a certain thing in a certain country, and then it's done.
Amazing. So we'll get back to some of those meta questions toward the end, I think. But let's get back to this other new tool that you've just launched recently, which I had queued up here. Okay, yeah, here we go. Splitscreen. So this is very interesting to me because it sort of allows you to sort of put on the glasses, the rose-colored glasses or the blue-tinted glasses, and see the world as others see it. So how did this come about, and how's it going? This is quite new, right?
Yeah, I think we launched it a month ago. If you scroll down, you can see like basically we try to show you what different news feeds look like. So for Biden and Trump voters, the most popular sources of news are really different, right? You can see New York Times on the Biden side,
Right.
Daily Wire on the Trump side. And
Right.
so it already shows you what you know, what we kind of know, but it's just it's incredible to see it in real life. Like, what is the top news of the day, right? So here you can see on the Biden side, it's all COVID. It's India COVID. It's reaching herd immunity in the U.S. On the Trump voter side, there's just well, I've noticed consistently, it's mostly culture war stuff, right? It's like
in the absence of policy, what do you talk about?
So there's just a lot of like, well, this one on Kerry is some sort of actual political story, I think. But basically, in general, it is a lot of cultural things. And you can see in the hashtag also that Earth Day is popular among Biden voters, does not appear to be popular among the Trump voters. So, and then you can look down further. The groups that are recommended are also different for
interesting
different groups. So the Biden voters are a little bit more into cooking. The Trump voters are a little bit more into the good old days. So it's just, it is really interesting to see how this machine that they've built, right, that picks up on what people want and what they like, and then feeds it back to them kind of concentrated. What does that look like? And so we built this because when we were looking at the data with Citizen Browser, we look at it mostly through the lens of accountability because we're investigative journalists. And so we look at it a lot through Facebook promised to not allow credit card discriminatory ads, but they did. But we noticed that it's just fun to look through. So we wanted to give people a chance to just look through the data, even though this might not be a super accountability story. It's just more of a, wow, the world looks really different to these groups. And if you do the drop down, you can see women versus men, which actually is the least different. We found that there's not a huge difference. And well, there's a little bit here you can see, but it's not as stark usually. Depends on the week. But it is pretty gendered. If you go down to the bottom, it's almost, I feel like I remember it's usually cooking on the women's side and cars on the men's side for the group recommendations. Yeah, so you look at the hashtag cats for women, NFL draft for men, right? Air fryer trips for women, MLB show for men. So it's like, it's incredibly gendered in a kind of really conventional way. And that I find interesting. And then we have the millennial boomer split.
Yeah, this really interests me because of my household.
Right. It's very funny in general. I find that the boomer group recommendations, like cranky old women, jokes, it's all jokes, I've noticed.
Oh my God.
And so then you have like
Star Wars, funny.
Star Wars for the millennials. You have
so is this a model that's expandable, in terms of the panels that you've developed? Because you could also do geographic.
Yeah, we did. So the thing is, we tested
but it depends on the size of
splits, but geography didn't yield that much. It was just, we didn't see that as being, we tried a whole bunch of groupings, red state, blue states, urban, rural, and we just didn't see interesting enough variations. Those were the three that just really seemed like they had the most meat on their bones, but we're always looking and trying to figure out different ways to expand. I think one thing that we would like to do is add topics so that you could say, well, what do people on both sides see on this topic or that topic, right? So those are the kinds of thing we're thinking about, because then you could do things like Paris Accords or, something where you wanted to see what exactly is happening on that issue. And then we're also would love to do other platforms, right? YouTube would be really interesting. TikTok would be really interesting.
Sure. Is that just a matter of support for other?
Yeah, it's insanely expensive to do what we're doing, right? Like using setting up a national panel maintaining browser software that all the panelists use, having customer support for those panelists when they can't get the browser to work. Like, this is a $500,000 a year project.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Which is teensy weensy when you compare that to the $100 billion.
It's teensy weensy, but it took me a long time to find that money, let me tell you. So, yeah, so I had to fundraise for that. And anyone who's watching who's a billionaire, feel free to call me.
And is there any, I know we were talking earlier about, self-policing, but is it possible for Facebook to design some of this into Facebook so that they're sort of taking you behind this, giving you that sense of this is how we work. We're trying, I don't know if that's even.
Try that. A year or two ago, they offered to provide some data to the research community. And it was kind of an epic disaster. The data never showed up in the form that the academics wanted, and everybody wrote mean blog posts at the end of it. And so I guess my point being, they don't have a great track record of sharing data with independent groups, and that was academics, where they were actually going to be able to vet and choose who they worked with. For journalists, like, the likelihood that we would just go to any company, let's say we went to Exxon and said, like, give us data about your safety record, and then just take it on faith that was like legit when we got it, right. It's pretty low, right? So even if we offer data, I'd be like, I would also like to check this with independent.
Yeah, I don't know if I hadn't thought about this before, but there are some organizations and think about like natural gas, the natural gas industry, okay? So I wrote a story in 2009 about all the leakage from oil fields and gas fields of the methane. Basically, natural gas comes out of pipelines, gets into the air, and it's a greenhouse gas. And that issue is intense, right? Because it's a powerful greenhouse gas. And there were solutions to it. Some companies are actually cutting the leaks, and good actors. EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, maybe 8 years ago, they started a research project, peer-reviewed work, going in proceedings of national academies and stuff, of papers that were looking at this up close. But they were partnering with the gas industry, because the only way to get close enough to the technology to actually understand the question of where these emissions coming from, which kinds of compressors required industry to say, come with us. But of course, it has the same issues with proprietary questions, et cetera. They somehow worked it out. EDF took a lot of heat for doing it, among other climate campaigners. You're working with Shell. How could you do that?
Right.
But it felt like maybe that's an analogy in some ways. It's an industry that's so big, so massive, so infrastructure, that the only way to actually analyze it critically in ways that can produce change would be to work with them. I'm literally laying this out there.
What you're describing, right, is what we call in journalism access journalism, right? And there is a role for it. Like, it is a field. There are people who are good at it, and they go inside and they still manage to produce a critical and interesting take. I feel like the New Yorker is sort of the ultimate in this, right? That's mostly, those stories are done with access, but they do reveal really important truths. It's its own genre. That's not our genre, right? We're adversarial experts, technological experts. We work from the outside, and we will find different things. And I think there needs to be both, but I don't think we should pretend that we can do all of them.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're right. Is anyone doing that other stuff though, in this sense? Like with Facebook and Google?
Yeah, I don't know. Casey Newton is a really great journalist, and he has started his own sort of platform. And Mark Zuckerberg has showed up at his little chats and stuff, and so he provides access. His readers want to see what Mark has to say. The Information, which is a sort of high-end tech trade paper in website, started by my former colleague Jessica Lesson from the Wall Street Journal, is also it's inside the room, what you need to know, and it costs $400 a year, and that's a totally legit type of journalism, and there you can do great work that way. I'm not good at that kind of thing, actually. Some people are, and that's not my skill set. My skill set is talking to programmers, figuring out big data collection strategies, and figuring out how to analyze data.
Well, that's good. Again, I think it's what you're describing is like the situation in every arena I've been in. Climate change is such a wicked problem. Super wicked, some call it. There's actually a technical paper that calls it a super wicked problem. You need everything. You need people looking at it from the technological side, from the politics side, from the investigative side. You know, Abraham Lustgarten's work at ProPublica is great, but it's insufficient grossly in terms of describing what you would have to do to solve the problem. So it's like, what I like here is we're providing a little bit of a lens on this particular approach, which I think is vital, and surely sounds like it could be scaled up.
Yeah.
You know,
I feel like I don't know that much about it. Maybe this is the wrong analogy, but to me, I think like if you think of us as climate scientists, we're the ones going on the iceberg and measuring the ice, right? Like we're the measurement people.
Yeah. Or you're also like, you're measuring the iceberg from underneath, you know, 90% of the iceberg.
We scuba under and did that, yeah.
It's below the surface. So you're digging into the part that we can't see, which can tip too. So what are your goals? You know, what kinds of stories are you pursuing this way? We'll get back to the split screen in a minute, but because I want to play with that a little bit.
You know, look, I think we've been publishing for just about 14 months, and we've done some ambitious projects. Like we measured, you know, how much Google was preferencing itself in search, putting its own products at the top of search results. And we have done, here, you have that. Oh no, that's the other one. That's the,
oh, this is a good one. Okay.
This is a great one.
Oh, this is great.
Oh
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your
like, so this is so crazy, but basically Google, on its YouTube ad buying platform. So like all these companies, you just buy ads self-service. You go onto an online page and just say, I want to buy an ad. And so you can search, like, I want to buy ads on videos about puppies. So we figured out that actually they had some words blocked that were hate terms in their search categories. You couldn't search, right, for Heil Hitler. But if you just remove the space between Heil Hitler, then you could search for it. And like white genocide with a space in between you was blocked, but white genocide without the space. And so this story was about how leaky their blockage of hate terms was. And then you don't have this one up, but we followed it up the next day with this really dispiriting story about how they had blocked all these social justice terms. So if you search for Black Lives Matter, it would say there's no videos available. And if you searched for, you know, all these terms that were basically people using them to try to get to change, and you could buy off of White Lives Matter. And the thing that was unfortunate about this story was after it was published, YouTube fixed the hate terms. So they did improve those, but they left the blocked you still can't do Black Lives Matter ad buying, which I find strange. I don't understand. A lot of advertisers, I think, would want to buy ads in that category.
One thing I was going to circle back to was the lack of a Nielsen's thing.
Yeah.
That really startles me. I hadn't thought about that or heard that before.
Yeah.
Is there? You said there's some technical legal reasons in terms of data sharing, but it's, you know, if it's a big enough arena, there must be some way to people can figure out how to manage
I think there are some services that do it for YouTube and Twitter, you know, because those platforms are open. But for the closed platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, where you kind of can't see the whole thing, you only see your piece of it, that data collection is not really available. And so that, I think, is why it doesn't exist. And it is surprising to me that advertisers who do have a lot of power haven't banded together to demand more. And I think here's my suspicion that these ads are still cheaper than what they're buying on TV. So it's like, oh, well, if it doesn't work, it's okay, right? Yeah. But that's changing, you know. This spending on internet advertising is increasing as a portion of everyone's ad budgets exponentially. And especially when we're all trapped in our houses and the only way we can see anything in the world is through the internet, right? And so these tech companies, for instance, had a banner year for advertising because it was like the only way to reach anyone. So I suspect there may be more pressure from advertisers in the future, but it is amazing that we're like, you know, 20 years into the internet economy and there's not real auditing and oversight by just on a commercial level.
Yeah. In mentioning the time scale, you reminded me of a question I think about quite often, which is, this is so new, this whole arena. You're doing this invaluable work at this snapshot in time of interrogating how these devices work and these systems work. Do you think we're like, some of this is sort of like the pioneer days? Do you have a vision that's more normalized going forward, or do you think it's impossible to think of an internet where there is accountability, liability, sort of a plan?
I think
or is it just going to keep kind of becoming bigger? And
I don't know. I mean, you could sort of play it out both ways, but I think if you think about, I always think back to the turn of the century when, basically the Industrial Revolution occurred and we moved to being like an industrial economy instead of agricultural. And there were a lot of abuses, right? There was child labor. There were no hourly limits on how long you could work in a factory. There were no safety. And it took, I want to say 50 years of muckraking journalists to expose those things and for society to react with oversight agencies, the creation of the FDA and OSHA and, so many oversight agencies. And if you think about it, this is what people have called it, the next industrial age, the third machine age. There's a lot of terms for it, but like this move to this digital economy, the information economy, it is a transformation, and it does track that it would take a while to address it and to rein it in. There is a possibility, though, that is different than last time around. And the dystopian view is that these companies are bigger than countries, and so they are not regulatable. Like, there is a possible scenario where Facebook just like literally is bigger than any government, and it can control political speech. And like, what if they did want to just shut down like any dissent against them? Like it's possible, right? And so there is a kind of a weird thing where like maybe they're unstoppable, but I have to say we have reined in organizations like this in the past.
I think that's an encouraging analogy, Sinclair Lewis, and so much that happened in those days. And for a second there, when you said the turn of the century, I was thinking you were talking about the turn to the 21st
Oh, this
century.
one. Yeah, this century. Sorry, I got to go back. I got to update my language.
Oh, well, you and me both. I grew up mostly in the 20th
old.
century. Yes. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about other folks out there who you keep track of. Chris Bale is at Duke, and he has this polarization lab working. There's a lot of people in academia. Peter Coleman at Columbia has the Difficult Conversations Laboratory, where he's trying to understand how you navigate complexity, conflict, and come out with some cooperation. Many of these things, though, still are, they're either at the personal responsibility end or toward that end of the landscape, as opposed to what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
How do we change the system? Although I will say the Splitscreen kind of nudges you toward that end too. Self-awareness of folks, if they look at those red-blue feeds, they could do something with that self-awareness. Hopefully, I assume that's part of your goal.
Yeah, I hope so.
But what do you have? What do you have? When you think about this end of things, what comes to mind?
I mean, it's so hard because obviously this technology is perfectly designed for polarization. Like, it wasn't built for that, but it is actually the perfect technology for it, right? This idea of what I call mass customization. So every single person can see their own custom worldview that's likely to be exactly what you want to see, right? That's what the machine feeds back to you. That doesn't help us build a shared understanding of the world we want to create together, right? And so even though mainstream media is hard to defend, right? I mean, it was run entirely by white men, and they chose the 6 o'clock news of the day, and their choices did not amplify anyone other than their own people, and so it's hard to say like those were the golden days, but there was a shared consensus, at least, about what the top news of the day was. We don't even have that anymore, and so these tools don't help. But it's, of course, as you know, impossible to talk about polarization without talking about cable news, right? I mean, Fox News kind of like led the charge here. The interesting thing about them is that it was driven by profit, right? It wasn't a ideological crusade. It was just like, oh, here's a niche. This is what's interesting about polarization is it's a kind of an end result of capitalism, right? Because capitalism is all about finding the biggest amount of profit for a smallest audience, right? And so that's what polarization is.
Yeah.
So it's not clear to me that tech is anything more than a tool in something that was already happening. That said, that's the whole point of tools, is you can use them to adjust things, right? We could turn the lever a different direction if we wanted to.
Yeah. Is there a prospect of sort of getting back to the split screen model of having a device where people can kind of gauge their own, where am I in the landscape of things? I guess in a way you're doing that because they're selecting, people are kind of.
Oh, that's an interesting
who they
question.
are.
I actually hadn't thought of that, only because one thing we're always trying to do is not collect personal data from people. And so you have to provide some data in order to do that. But we could find a privacy protecting way to do that. That would be an interesting idea.
I was looking on Chris. I asked Chris if he might be able to come on. He couldn't today, but I was exploring his website this morning before we were getting going, and they have a open platforms. You can do it. They have a Twitter. It says what do your tweets say about your politics? And I actually did this today.
Oh, good. What did you find?
Hold on. We'll do it in real time. Here we go. So here I am. Revkin. Click to see your results. Analyzing your. They should have a little drum roll sound.
Oh my God, I'm kind of scared about seeing mine.
Well, you plug it in later. You can only do your own, by the way.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay,
there I am. Ideology score.
Oh, you're conservative? Oh no, you're.
Well, no. See, I'm kind of middle brow.
Okay.
I have layers. I'm libertarian in some ways and very liberal in other ways.
Yeah.
But look at it. Says your score is similar to those of two elected officials.
That's funny.
It's an interesting little device. So if people have some sense of identifying where they are in the landscape of things, then I think that can possibly lead to some more reasoned, at least flashes of looking at the wider landscape of what people are thinking and doing. But that's, again, for another day. We'll do more on that. Your work is mainly invaluable, I think, in that providing that feedback to people, but also to Facebook itself and the other entities.
Yeah.
And it sounds like they're listening, at least to a certain extent. Facebook pledges to remove discriminatory credit loan ads. Have they done that yet, or?
Well, it's hard for us to say. Our panelists haven't seen it, but we only. See
right, because that would hit. Boy, you have to need.
Yeah. So I'm assuming they did. The thing is, though, did they stop whatever it was that allowed these credit card companies to bypass their protections is another question, right? It's easy to identify the 4 ads we brought to your attention. It's totally different to plug whatever hole it was that allowed them to get there in the first place.
So before we'll close out soon, where do you think we're at in these sort of post-Cambridge Analytica days, looking at those issues?
Yeah.
Is this landscape improving yet, or are we still deep in it?
No, it's definitely not improving. Facebook, just 2 weeks ago said that they had lost 533 million users, names, not passwords, phone numbers. I don't know if you noticed that. They were.
I missed that.
Yeah, they've been leaked onto a hacker forum. So just FYI, your phone number, etc. So no, the things are not getting better, right? Like just more broadly, even than Facebook, right? We don't have data breach penalties, right? Companies don't have to pay. Like I always actually try to talk about an environmental model for data, which is that basically one of the ways that we cleaned up the environment, obviously we missed the carbon situation, but the rivers used to be on fire, things were a lot worse. And one of the ways we did that was just with strict penalties, right? Emissions, and if you passed a certain limit, you paid. And also public shaming, right? Like by naming the people who were emitting. And then we had incredible collective liability situation with Superfund, which I think is almost impossible to imagine happening today. But think about that for data. Think about these companies spill your data. They don't have to pay. They put the burden on you. They say, why don't you go get a credit check, right? You're supposed to keep track of it. And then if it's not clear who leaked it, right? Because in this case, Facebook doesn't really know who hacked them and put it on there. there is no collective liability. Like there's no super fund to say like who's going to clean it up, who's going to pay. And so so I think we actually do need I think pollution and privacy are really similar issues. They are hard to attribute often the source of the pollution or the source of the leak. The harms are hard to identify. Like you don't know why you have cancer. You think it's because you live near the plant. Same thing with data. You don't know why you didn't get the mortgage, but you think it might be because of like some bad data somewhere. And so I think we would learn like as we think about regulating data, the data economy, actually there's a lot of lessons from how we regulated the environment, which actually had to do with not just these emissions and fines, but also changing norms, right? We also started recycling and picking up dog poop. And I think it has to be all the way from top to bottom the same way.
That's really interesting. As you were speaking about that, I found this paper.
Yeah, it's a great paper. I've spoken to him
before. I'm going to look into this. It just feels, it is a very resonant issue. And as this paper seems to articulate, it's a question between public good, the public sphere, and if it's private.
I have a chapter in my book on this in Dragnet Nation on pollution and privacy. So recommend you take a look at that too.
I'm always eager to, none of these conversations ever end up with like, aha, there we did it, we solved it.
No.
So I think there's another one to do for sure. Let me see if I can track down Omri here. But these issues, digital information is the fuel of the new economy. It's, not only that, it's the fuel of cultural fires too.
Exactly.
Capital assaults. And that really takes this to another level. And, a Clean Air Act for information, again, considering our politics these days, it seems
it's hard to imagine.
Hard to believe. Although this is an issue that in some ways there is.
It is a somewhat bipartisan issue. Yeah. There is like a shared set. It's a lot of the privacy protection bills in Congress that are proposed, none of which have passed, but are bipartisan. There's a lot of bipartisan support because everybody is affected, by personal data being swung around our economy.
Or by platform control of who speaks or not.
Yeah. Exactly.
Issue.
Correct.
Facebook it's been a busy week for Facebook on that front.
Yeah.
The oversight board.
That was great.
Well, this has been great to have you on today. It's a busy end of the week. I'm sure you've got tons to do, as we all do. So maybe we'll call it there. It's been this idea of information pollution, of the work you're doing using big tech's tools to show how its platforms shape our online worlds is invaluable. And I'm really glad the Markup exists. So good luck.
Thank you.
Building on the model you've developed, and keep it up.
Thanks.
So just to conclude, this is the Earth Institute, Columbia Climate School, Sustain What webcast, frequent sessions interrogating the world's complicated problems, ones that are most consequential, and trying to find paths towards solutions. No easy fixes here. We'll do more, and it'd be great to have you back sometime, or one of your colleagues to go a little deeper.
All of the above.
Again, we've been with Julia Angwin, the longtime data-driven journalist who is now the founder and running the Markup. And so wherever you are, try to keep aware of your own biases, try to keep aware of people maybe manipulating them, and share this when we're done. It's running on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And it'll be archived as soon as we're done. So thanks again for being here today, Julia.
Thank you.
And,